What I want to do is I'm going to sort of squeeze the nozzle down so you're not drinking from a fire hose and you're drinking more from a Dixie cup, okay? And this is strictly the human reference. This is what happened to a group of people in the United States 2 years ago on a February evening, on Saturday night, near in the Delta of Mississippi, near the Mississippi River, actually along a little river called the Yazoo River. And this is a small community called Satartia. Only about 60 to 65 people live in the little village of Satartia, and then there's a few hundred folks around Satartia. And the layout of the land is very important here, and this will echo some of what has been said about characteristics of carbon dioxide. I call this the gassing of Sartartia because this is an event that, more than anything else, was almost like a World War I situation where a cloud of gas just rolled over this town. It starts. Let's just start by taking a look. I'm sorry these images aren't bigger, but I'm doing my best here as a kind of a Luddite in this advanced business of presenting slideshows and so on webinars. But this is the little town of Satartia. You can see all this in my piece in HuffPost. At the end, there'll be a URL for that. But this is mostly older folks. This pipeline rupture was an explosion of the pipeline, a circumference weld, which holds the two pieces of pipeline, failed in this explosion. It happened around 7:07 p.m. On a Saturday night, February 22nd. And this plume of gas descended on the town almost immediately. And within 4 or 5 minutes, there were about 20 to 25 people who were rendered unconscious by the cloud. That was just, and I'm talking about people who collapsed, fell down at a cookout that they were attending by the river. Literally, people just fell to the floor unconscious, wherever they were, in their homes, in their cars, doing whatever they were doing. The 911 calls began about 7:13, and I'm going to play you one of those. And again, as Jane said, she hoped that you remembered the visuals of the explosion. I hope you remember some of these personal stories. I'm going to play this for you now.
911. Okay, I am on Highway 433. I just turned off Satartia on Highway 3 in Michigan. And it's like a really strong smoke. And I don't know if something's on fire, something's burning. I just like move into smoke. And it's like a really strong fume coming up. I don't know what's going on. My car stopped. It won't move. And we just got out of the car and started walking because I didn't know if anything was going to explode. I don't know what's going on. But
okay, where at on 433 are you? How far from Highway 3?
Like, I just turned off Highway 3 probably like 2 or 3 minutes ago.
About how far?
2 or 3 minutes ago, out from Highway 3 onto Highway 433. Like, I don't know what the fume is.
Okay, is it coming from your car or?
No, ma'am.
It's in the area. Yes, ma'am. Can I get your name?
Jessica Mason. Is she okay? Who is that? Is she okay? Okay, could we get a paramedic or something?
Okay, what's going on?
She's on the ground. She's laying on the ground. I don't know if she's having a seizure or not. Could you please get somebody quick?
Okay, hold on. Let me put you through to them. So she said they're having a seizure.
Wesley, do she have like? Oh my gosh, should we do something like lay her on her back?
Hold on a second. I'm gonna put you through to them. So it's okay.
Okay.
Hold on just a second, ma'am.
Okay, Just if I hope everyone could hear that and that was clear. But let me just get back to my presentation here. Hold on. Okay. So that's the sound of a woman who reported another woman having a seizure. That car broke down. The engine stopped running, as was mentioned that sometimes happens. Well, if there's CO2 in the air and there's enough of it, as there was from this rupture, here's the rupture itself. That's what it looked like. Cars are going. All the cars in Satartia stopped running. People were trying to flee. Their cars died. People jumped out of their cars and they were overcome. Many of them were those who remained conscious, nevertheless had trouble. They were disoriented. One of the toxic effects here is that there's a sort of drunken state that people who are under the influence of this gas feel. It's been described as feeling like you're on a 3-day drunk. You're not coordinated. You can't think clearly. People do and say irrational things, and they are incapable of getting themselves out of harm's way, not only because they no longer have a car, but because they simply wander around confused and unable to help themselves. But you can see that this is a huge crater here. This is 40 or 50 feet all the way across. This pipe was completely exposed by explosion. This is the frozen area of material that came out well below, very, very cold enough to freeze case-hardened steel. When these kinds of events, when CO2 leaks out in quantity at the enhanced oil recovery site at an oil field, it's so cold that the steel structure of the drilling rig freezes so solid that you can smash it with a sledgehammer into pieces. That's how cold this is. So that's one quick toxic effect right in the area of the pipeline. And then the plume descended, the gaseous cloud, which we call the plume, descended along a creek bed, which was below here, and into the town. So it followed the contours of the land. There's very little wind that night, and it settled in the town. I'm just going to show you again, so that everybody is just has a human reference. These are the victims. This is Demarest Burns. He was trapped in a car but died only about 200 or 300 feet from the pipeline when it ruptured that night. At about 7:15, he called his mother and said, and sounded confused and agitated and tried to warn her about some sort of a pipeline explosion. About a minute later, he commented that, oh, our car has just died. And then he and his two friends, actually relatives, all were unconscious. They woke up 4 hours later in the hospital, and they have had, all three of them, who were really in that gas for hours, have had continuing nonstop health problems of various kinds, including difficulty, mental impairment, cognitive difficulties, continued breathing problems. Demarest here, as you can see, he is on oxygen. This was 2 weeks after the event, and still having breathing difficulties. I'm not going to take you through all the stories. There isn't time for that, but this is just to give you an idea of the variety of people. Demarest is a young man in his 30s. This is Hugh Martin, who is an Army vet, a man in his late 50s. He collapsed at this picnic that they were having outdoors by the Yazoo River. His mother, he went and rescued his mother. She was almost unconscious when he reached her in her home, which was just a few blocks away. Tossed her in the back of his pickup, and she never had suffered from any lung issues before, and now she is on inhalers of various kinds, and this is almost 2 years later. There are several other people. This is a COPD sufferer who almost died on the way to the hospital. So just to reiterate here, what are we looking at? Well, as has been already mentioned, when you look at the Navigator Summit or these other pipeline proposals, you need to keep in mind that you can't say this enough. This is not the bubbles in your soda. It's a dangerous industrial product. It requires public education, training for first responders and healthcare providers, and so on. The relevant facts from what happened in Satartia are, this was, and you may hear some residents here in Minnesota and Iowa and Nebraska and other places, this was a poor rural community, primarily elderly, and most of these folks, if they did know that there was a CO2 pipeline, they had no idea what that meant. There was no evacuation plan or warning system. Hospitals were uninformed. They didn't know how to treat the victims. They were flooded with people. These two little regional hospitals were completely overwhelmed, as more than 200 people were evacuated and almost 50 wound up being hospitalized that night. Although the pipeline company Denbury had early knowledge of the leak, they didn't alert people. This is not unusual. It's happened with other pipelines where the people on the ground find out that the company knew, but either didn't act quickly or didn't notify them. 911, as you can hear in that call, really didn't know what the heck it was dealing with. And they frequently told victims it was a natural gas leak, which didn't help either. CO2, although we all know what it is a little studied hazardous material. I talked to an emergency room specialist who has studied CO2, and I asked him what made him interested in CO2. He said, I'm not interested in CO2. He said, no one is interested in CO2. It's not a material that's received a lot of study. There hasn't seemed to be any good reason for it. The World Health Organization told me that, in fact, Satartia was the first ever mass outdoor exposure to toxic levels of CO2 from an anthropogenic source, so a pipeline accident, first one anywhere. It demonstrated the very limited medical knowledge that we have about human exposure. There really haven't been studies, as someone else has mentioned. And these are some of the symptoms that people have and have continued to have: cognitive impairment, reduced lung capacity, depression, PTSD, and fatigue. I'm going to show you an image here that is, I'm going to give you a trigger warning. This is a dead person, but I'm going to open this by saying that this is not the only CO2 accident. There was a major natural occurrence of a CO2 bubble that came out of a lake in Cameroon in Africa and killed more than 1,700 people in a single night, and all the animals that they had in this little series of villages around Lake Nyos is the area. This is one of the people who just died sleeping. Many people were found in this condition. Others had managed to crawl out of their homes before they died, and some were unconscious for several hours and survived, but there were only a few dozen of those. They now have a Lake Nyos Survivors Organization. I urge you to check out their website on Facebook. What do the CO2 pipeline companies believe about CO2? Well, Denbury, which was responsible for the leak in Satartia, had this to say about Lake Nyos. They included the slide, interestingly enough, in a presentation that was basically supposed to show how careful they were being. This is in 2015. How careful they were being with CO2, and that they were doing tests to see what would happen if there was a pipeline rupture. So they staged the pipeline rupture, but none of the results were relevant to what happened in Satartia, and it grossly understated what happened. Nevertheless, as you can see from this, or I hope you can see from this, in Lake Nyos, they took Lake Nyos very seriously enough to address a conference of oil and gas people and put this into that presentation that it killed 1,700 people, and noting here at the bottom, all living things within 15 miles around the crater were killed. So if we're talking on a sort of common sense level about what hazardous is, I'm having a hard time understanding how anyone could have a serious question about whether carbon dioxide is hazardous, but I'll give you a few more reasons. CO2 has long been used for the euthanization of lab animals and other animals, but Humane Society and international bodies have now believed that death by CO2 is too painful and distressful to the animal. And here's a quote from a paper that was published on this issue by a veterinary group. Leach et al. Concluded that CO2, either alone or in combination with argon, cannot be used humanely at any concentration and is therefore unacceptable as a euthanasia agent for laboratory rodents, particularly when more humane methods exist. So that's the science as it applies to lab animals. I hope sincerely that we give ourselves as a species a bit more consideration. There's been, you're going to hear, if you haven't already, from Summit and Navigator and other companies that their CO2 is pure and that they won't face the problems that some, for instance, EOR operations have, where it may be contaminated with hydrogen sulfide and other chemicals. And this is simply a myth. CO2 is inherently hazardous. There are regulatory loopholes, unfortunately. OSHA classifies CO2 as a hazardous material. You will see, I have a brief couple of slides on this, but Sandra will go into more depth on this. But all the CO2 industry material safety data sheets have a pretty frightening list of effects from CO2. The existing regulatory regime by the relevant federal agencies is inadequate, largely because there's been so little pipelining of CO2. There's only the 5,000 miles compared to 2.6 million miles of natural gas and oil pipelines. So it's a gnat, really, on the body of a much bigger enterprise here. We've talked about the much higher pressures, which makes it much more dangerous. Here are those CO2 material safety data sheets warning that it can cause rapid suffocation, it can increase respiration and heart rate, nervous system damage, frostbite, as you saw from that slide where the freezing cold material came out. Here is a graduated chart of what happens at different concentrations, beginning with headaches and confusion and ending with unconsciousness, seizures, and death. About 100 people die every year from basically interacting with CO2 in forms such as the carbon dioxide that's used in bars or restaurants to force your various mixers and soft drinks out of the spigots at the bar. So we have the 100 people a year who die from accidental inhalation of pure CO2 in those applications. We have the Lake Nile situation. Now we have a warning, to what seems like a warning to me, from something that can happen in a populated area in the United States. The already mentioned the classification by OSHA, and this is very important, is the limited amount of information we have about toxic effects from sublethal exposure to CO2. In other words, people like the people in Satartia, some of whom were in that cloud for anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour or more and survived, but have all sorts of symptoms, some of which are really kind of first of its kind study in demonstrating what happens to people who survive a CO2 incident, but are really never the same. You're going to hear the industry just, poo-poo this and so on. I have to tell you that if they have studies that show differently, I would like to see them, because 2 years of studying this have not revealed any of those. Car engines don't sometimes die. In a situation like Satartia, all the engines died, and some of those cars were scattered over the landscape the next day. Their doors open, windows smashed, where emergency responders went in to rescue the victims and so on. So it was a real catastrophic event for this little community. Here again, the lack of knowledge. In the US, we have all this experience, 30 years of experience with CO2 pipelines, but we have very little information on what happens when they break. And here's my emergency room expert talking about the very small amount of literature. So most of the other things in terms of the pipeline network and what the impacts would be have been covered. I will just say this is from the Congressional Research Service, and this is their prediction, which is that if the nation's CO2 pipeline network expands significantly to support CCS, and if this expansion includes more pipelines near populated areas, we're going to see more accidents. That is an absolute certainty. There's a lot of things we can do, but creating a more robust regulatory structure at the federal level and certainly at the state level, where a lot of these pipelines are now originating, is an absolute must. And this is me and my organization, and this is the URL from my HuffPost investigation, which I urge you to read. And thank you. It's been an honor to be here and speak to you.